Hello again. It's Roosevelt, and welcome to If You Can't Say Amen, Say Ouch, where we regularly discuss Christian social responsibility, ethical, economic, environmental, and philanthropic, what the Bible has to say about them. Recently, when I was thinking about what I would say to introduce today's episode, I thought about my brother Ted. He and I were very close. I'm sorry to say that he's no longer with us. But we did everything together, and from time to time we had disagreements. We even fought a couple of times. But our problems never lasted long. You see, we were raised in the same house and were taught the same set of values, right and wrong. So fixing things usually wasn't that hard, but it required both of us. Reconciliation is not a DIY sort of thing. It really takes participation from both sides. It also takes two major actions, repentance and forgiveness. Today's Christian social responsibility topic centers around ethics, racial ethics. Buckle up. Today's guest was a pastor's kid and quickly came to understand that loving God was the most important choice he could make in his life. As he got older, he came to appreciate that a relationship with Jesus Christ was not only spiritually fulfilling, but intellectually and emotionally satisfying as well. Professionally, he started off acting on stage and in media, and he wrote and directed some Christian films and documentaries when he was younger. He spent quite a while in motion pictures and television development, and then as a marketing executive at a successful .com. He has always maintained a close relationship and love for the local church and has been a sought-after speaker as well as writer of devotions and dramatic material used in worship. He has two sons, and he's a great guy to know. So let me welcome Kevin Cushing to If You Can't Say Amen, Say Ouch. Okay, Kevin, thank you for coming. As we discussed, this program is about Christian social responsibility.
Yeah.
And we talked about what that entails, economic, environmental, philanthropic, and ethical, and you chose ethical, right?
Yeah, well, I was intrigued by the opportunity to talk a little bit about racial unity, racial diversity. It's something that has been a lifelong interest, but in the last few years, I feel like God's been growing more of a message in me that I want to communicate to other white people, some of the observations and things that I've learned. So God's kind of birthing. I do a lot of speaking in general. I do a lot of preaching, but I want to do more talking on this topic. So being with you today is an opportunity for me to continue to develop my fluency with speaking about race, again, from my perspective, from the perspective of a guy who grew up in Orange County and didn't even meet a black person until I was about 12 years old. You know? And it's just been something that God's really been working in my heart and mind to care more and more about through some of the relationships I've developed, especially in the last 5 years, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I really appreciate that. That's one reason I asked you to be here. Because, Proverbs says to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly and defend the rights of the poor and the needy.
Yes.
And, they cannot speak for themselves part. Those are people that can't speak for themselves. They need somebody else to get the job done along with them. And that has to do, for me, in my mind, with a lot of different minorities. Because, minority, if you're in a minority group, you can speak your mind.
Right.
But it's easier to get heard when a group of people from the majority group speak along with you.
Yes. I've had the opportunity to, in the last several years, go to conferences, be part of groups that were addressing the issue of racial diversity, racial unity. And so often I find that the people who are leading on this issue or trying to educate on this issue are people of color, often generally African American, and I think that's reasonable, because obviously they have so much at stake to try and inform and educate. But I get concerned when I don't see enough white people also showing leadership in that area, because it was white people who created a racist environment in our country and our world to begin with. And we have to be part of the solution and part of the conversation. And I think we have to be careful. We can't own the issue. It can't be a sense of, okay, I'm taking over, and because that won't work. But we have to be equal partners in figuring out solutions and talking to each other and just being involved in each other's lives in a deeper way.
Yeah, the type of ownership that I think, you can't own the issue, but you can own your share of responsibility for the solution.
What's gone on.
Yeah.
And I think this is something, I'm glad you brought this up, because I think this is something where some white people get very defensive.
Yeah.
They, the common thing is, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist thought in my head. I don't know why you're trying to make me feel bad about something. Like, I acknowledge that racism has happened or still happens. And I feel like among the Christian community, there's not a willingness to acknowledge corporate sin enough of the time. That we all, when I look in the Bible, I see figures like Daniel, and he would get on his knees and pray on behalf of the sins of the people that he was part of. Or same thing with Ezra, same thing with Moses. There were times when they got on their knees before God and they corporately confessed the sin of their people. Now, Daniel and Moses, Ezra, those guys were extremely righteous people. So I doubt that they were personally very guilty of some of the things they were confessing. But they showed a willingness to be humble and to identify with the sins of the people that they loved and that they were a part of. And I think that we've lost a lot of that in the Christian community. Like, there's no shame really in saying, hey, I've been stained by this. This is a part of my heritage. It's hurt a lot of people. And I think we need to be open about that and not get all like, oh, I don't want to, you're putting something on me that doesn't, apply to me. I think that's not a Christian attitude.
Yeah.
It's the world's attitude. I understand why the world might feel that way, but I don't think as Christians that we should approach things in that way.
Not only that, though, but there are people that don't consider themselves to be a part of what is happening, or what has happened, or what's continuing to happen, but they don't take any ownership for adding to any type of solution or speaking up. Yeah, for instance, in 2019, the median white household income was $188,200 in wealth. Well, not income, but wealth. Almost 8 times that of the typical Black American household.
Right.
Almost 8 times. And while there are a lot of people that can say that. That can say that they don't feel that they contribute to the problem. Not contributing to the solution is contributing to the problem.
And not acknowledging that, making it about, well, I don't know, there must be something wrong with those people of color. They just can't pull themselves up, I'm just completing a book that somebody gave to me recently called The Color of Law. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
But it's an amazing, it was written by a guy, he's a Jewish attorney, I think he's from the Bay Area, and it exhaustively documents how America was segregated and slums were created by virtue of law and by virtue of, in other words, this wasn't just like, oh, one group didn't feel comfortable with the other, so they just sort of gravitated to their given areas and one thrived and the other didn't. He systematically documents in this book, The Color of Law, and I recommend this. And he goes all over the country. He starts in the Bay Area, but he goes to the South. He goes to parts of the country that you generally think of as more liberal, and shows how even in those areas there were laws and governmental policies and practices that deliberately kept white and black people apart and always gave the white people the better loans, the better areas, the better neighborhoods, put black people into areas that were maybe more industrial to live in, where they were, crowded them in, didn't give them the proper kinds of access to housing loans. So they were denied the opportunity to build the kind of wealth that white people were given. And that's not a theory, that's a documented fact. And it's something that really is unconstitutional. If you go back and look at some of the amendments that have been added to the Constitution, all of these practices, which were blessed by local and state and county governments, really are unconstitutional because they're treating people unequally, but it was just condoned. It was thought, well, we don't want to, offend people's sensibilities, so we need to keep black people and white people apart. And it created this wealth gap that you're talking about.
It definitely did. That's why I try to, or that's why the purpose of this talk show is to be directed at Christians. See, I don't feel like I have any leverage with anybody but Christians.
Yeah.
Because with Christian people, the leverage I have is the Bible.
Yeah, that's true.
That's what I have. I have the Bible as a leverage.
Right.
I can say to I can say to someone that, Proverbs says, the righteous man who is swayed by the wicked is like a murky spring or a polluted well. Now, and they can say to me, well, I'm not swayed by the wicked. Well, I don't know, but you go along with children being separated from their parents and attempts to dismantle Social Security and gun control issues and gerrymandering and redlining and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you really think about it,
yes,
you kind of really are being swayed by the wicked, because all of those things are wicked. All of those things are wicked. So
right.
I try to direct this toward Christians because I don't have any frame of reference for any leverage otherwise.
Yes.
Because I'm a Christian. You told me that you grew up, I think the word that you used was Republican, but I'm trying not to be political. To try to be as
well, I think Republican means a whole lot different thing right now than it did even 6-7 years ago.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that you meant sort of that you grew up right-wing evangelical. Would that be right?
Yeah. I was influenced by my parents, and my parents were loving, godly people. My dad was a pastor, but their politics were definitely far to the right. They were Nixon supporters until Nixon, messed up in a way that they couldn't ignore any longer. And so, I grew up, and the thought of being a Republican is, hey, we're for limited government, fiscal responsibility, biblically moral values. Those were the kinds of things I thought that Republicans believed in. So, I grew up, I was a Republican, and I would occasionally cross over and vote for a Democrat, but rarely, I generally voted Republican. I was when Barack Obama ran against John McCain, I was very moved by his campaign, and I wanted to see somebody who was that well-spoken be our president, who could address issues so well in public discourse. So I voted for Barack Obama, and that was part of it was because of who Mr. McCain nominated to be his vice president. I was like, well, that doesn't show good judgment at all. So I got to vote for Mr. Obama. So anyhow, I grew up Republican, but I say all that just to say, the recent changes in the Republican Party. I left the party, around the time Trump looked like he was going to be the nominee, because I was like, this is crazy, and I don't want to be associated with craziness. I don't want people to assume that I don't view the world with reality anymore. So I know you don't want to get political, but that was kind of my evolution. And so, and growing up in Orange County, like I said, not a diverse area. Getting back to race, I went to a very large church for over 20 years in Orange County. 2,000, 2,500 people. I think at the earliest times I was going there might have been 2 black people who went to the whole church. By the time I left, there was maybe 6. So that's kind of where that was. And I always wondered, I didn't really have the language or I wasn't bold enough to, but I was always like, what's that like? What is it like to be in a community where there are so few, who look like you, who maybe have, some of your experiences? And, they were wonderful people, who were very involved in the life of the church and served well in the church. So when the Promise Keepers movement came through the churches in the 90s, our men's group, they encouraged us all to come to these stadium events, and part of their mission was they wanted to try and show more diversity, and so they get people together denominationally. Churches from all over Southern California would go to the Coliseum, and we'd have worship, and they'd have speakers of every race, on the over the weekend. And so my church got involved in that, and we really enjoyed doing that. And I know at the end of the weekend, one of the highlights was always in the 2 or 3 years I went, they would have E.V. Hill, who was the pastor of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church at the time. This was the early 90s. And he had a very fiery, exciting, kind of cheerleading way of, he'd get ramped up in his preaching, and he'd have all the guys on their feet, and we'd be calling and responding, and, he just had everybody. And the white people that I knew, we'd never experienced anything like that. This is all like, it was like, going to Disneyland for a preaching, or something. So we'd come back all fired up, and everybody, it was always the highlight. Wasn't E.V. Hill amazing? Wasn't E.V. Hill great? And I was so happy to see, by the way, that towards the end of his career, I think he got a regular ministry on TBN where he was preaching regularly. So he got a lot of national recognition. Yeah. And so I remember one year we came back, and the leadership of my men's group said, well, we got to keep this spirit going. This was a great event. How can we keep this going back at our regular church? So they decided, look, let's have a men's prayer breakfast, a month later, and try and rekindle this. We'll have some great singing and everything. And so they looked around, and their thought was, because we didn't really have diversity represented in our church, I think they looked around our denomination and searched for, are there any black pastors that we can invite to come speak? And I wasn't involved in this, but I'm reconstructing what must have happened. Because the next thing you know, they're having a prayer breakfast, and they are printing posters and tickets and saying, come to our prayer breakfast and hear, Pete so-and-so. And underneath it said in quotes, a young E.V. Hill. And so we're all like, oh, cool. If he's like E.V. Hill, well, of course we're going to be there. This is going to be great. Everybody's all like excited. And of course, that's like code, It's like a bunch of white people saying like, by the way, he's going to be black. You just wanted it's like, that's what that's telling you, right? But we all thought it also meant that we were going to all get revved up and inspired, everything. So this gentleman, Pete, this pastor, comes and speaks to us that morning, on a Saturday morning, and he gave a wonderful talk. But he was low-key, he was scholarly, he had deep things to say, but it wasn't like a fiery, and I think the guys in the room were all like, wait. And I realized as I'm sitting there like, oh my gosh, this is like such an example. It's like, this is white people thinking that all black people do things the same way. Like if you invite a black preacher, this is what's going to happen. They're just going to explode and, put on a big show for us, and that's not who this guy was. Yeah. And I was so embarrassed, just because of all of the way they had publicized it and the way I knew that our particular audience was looking forward to that. And I was like, there's a big lesson in that. It's like, because these were well-intentioned people. They were trying to promote diversity in a sense, or expose us to more diversity, but there was an assumption made in the way they publicized to, again, that like if you invite a black preacher, you're going to have one type of experience, and not understanding that there's as much diversity of personality and flavor, within the black community as there is in any other community. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it was an important lesson, and it just caused me, that was kind of a watershed. And I started to think about other times when I was in majority white situations where, rude things were said, but without maybe meaning to be rude, but it was rude because maybe assumptions were made about black people that were in our midst. And I just became very sensitive to that. And more recently, I became involved in our church, which is much more diverse. And I had actually been to a church before this that was quite diverse, but I liked that the leadership of our church, that we had an African-American pastor, and other people on staff who were black. And in coming to the church, I really wanted to become closer to more people of color in a true friendship way, not just like a hi, how you doing, and we're friendly with each other, but really understand what goes on in each other's lives. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to a book club actually that our pastor's wife put together that encouraged that kind of conversation, and so I became closer to a number of people who were black, and just to understand the day-to-day things that they deal with that still go on that I didn't, as a white person, I didn't realize, in the group we had people who were attorneys and college professors, professional people. But when they say, hey, and I go into a clothing outlet, and the security person immediately notices me and follows me around the store while I'm doing my shopping. It's like wow. It's
That
like,
happens to my wife at Ralph's in Manhattan Beach. And I actually had to go and talk to the security company and tell them that it was something that we noticed,
wow.
and that more people than us noticed, and they should pay closer attention to that.
Wow.
I actually
Good for you.
confronted that situation.
Good.
Because my wife's got a master's degree. I mean,
Yeah.
she's.
Yeah.
I mean,
and nor should anybody have to put on airs to earn the right to be there, right?
Right,
Like we shouldn't have to say, well, I'm highly qualified to be.
Yeah,
It's like there's just a whole different expectation that still goes on. And what I noticed was sometimes I would take some of these stories and experiences, and I would be back, maybe I was getting a haircut, or I'd be talking to white friends, and I'd share some of the things I was learning in this book club. And I noticed that there was this skepticism, this resistance, this like not wanting to believe that this is really happening. And I was like, I thought that was sad but interesting. I was like, what? And sometimes I'm confronted with the attitude when I talk to other white people, just one-on-one, and say, here's what some of my black friends are experiencing. The feeling is like, well, we all have unfair things happen to us. And they're probably being overly sensitive and chalking it up to race when it's probably not a racial thing. That is, I think, a prevailing attitude of many white people when they hear stories. And the weird thing is, they know the news. They hear about the really bad stuff that goes on that is clearly racially motivated, and so they understand there's racism out there, but they don't want to believe that it's in their backyard and that it's day to day, and what it's like. Like I have a black friend. She told me, when she has an exchange that she has to do at a store, and if there's anything weird, like she doesn't have the right receipt, or it may be something they might question, she calls ahead. She talks to somebody. She says, I've got this exchange. Here's what I'm doing. I want to bring this in. I want to see if I can exchange it for this. Is this going to be okay? Okay, what's your name, by the way? Gets the person's name. And then she walks into the store having already identified who she's going to talk to, what the situation was, because she's had too many times of showing up as a black person and just being doubted or disbelieved or not helped. And so, to go to those kind of lengths, like as white people, we don't have to think that way, sadly. And the other thing I've learned too is that even white people who are very well intentioned, we have a luxury in that we can sort of check in and check out of this issue of racism. Like if we want to be all in and compassionate and get involved, then great. But we have this ability at any time, because it's overwhelming, as it's a very heavy issue, and it overwhelms you, and we can step away and take a vacation from the issue. That's a privilege that people of color don't have.
Yeah, we don't have that. That's
and
true.
the more you become close to and close friends with people who don't look like you, the more that sits heavy with you, because I may not be experiencing racism, but I'm aware of how maybe something is affecting a close friend of mine who is. Yeah. When we had the Buffalo shooting just a couple of weeks ago, and it was an odd thing because the very next day, which was Sunday, so our church, our senior pastor's African American. We have other African Americans on staff. But it happened that the very next day he was out of town, and that had been planned. And so the staff people who were running the service was a white person preaching, and another person leading music. So everybody who was speaking that day happened not to be black. And I noticed the next day nobody mentioned that shooting that had just occurred the day before. And yet I knew it was sitting very heavy with a lot of my friends. And so I just, I didn't think, I was like, wow, that feels bad to me, And so a few days after that, I texted our pastor when he was back in town. I was like, hey, and I tried to, kind of say, hey, I'm sure they were still processing. Maybe they didn't know what to say. But I said, like, would you be interested in me writing a lament or something? Because I write a lot of material for worship and a lot of devotions. And so he allowed me to speak a lament the following week in our church, for that incident, and speak the names of the people. And so I was felt very privileged to be able to do that. But it was just interesting to me because, I know the people on our staff who are white, they would not have wanted to be insensitive, but sometimes we just don't think, like I talked about being able to step away. When a shooting happens in Buffalo, 3,000 miles away, we also go, oh, that is horrible. That is just disgusting. That's horrible. But a couple hours later, we're going, okay, so what's for dinner?
Yeah.
Like we're not. Whereas I have other friends who are living in predominantly black neighborhoods are going like, wow, you mean somebody might actually target a black neighborhood? Like I always felt safe here. Now I need to worry when I go to the grocery store in my own neighborhood among my own people. And I knew those were the kinds of thoughts that people were having.
Well, people, they tend to shy away from something that's going to take a little intestinal fortitude to face up to. That's why I joke and say that America's favorite pastime is deflection. I ask you where you're going and you tell me where you've been.
Wait, can you explain that to me a little bit more? You asked
deflection. You talk about somebody says, well, those. It's a shame that all of those people got killed in Buffalo. Okay, and then they start to talk about. You start to talk about something other than what just happened, and something that's related that you can relate to that happened without talking about.
Yes,
or addressing or addressing directly what the issue happens to be. Like, for instance, Colin Kaepernick takes a kneel.
Yeah.
He's kneeling because of police violence.
Right.
But they deflect that into disrespect for the flag,
yes,
and disrespect for the military and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
That's not what that was about at all.
Sometimes they call that whataboutism, right?
Yeah.
Like you point out one thing and you go, well, what about this?
Yeah, well, what about this? So in recent years, I've noticed that deflection has been a really, really big thing in America.
Yeah.
People don't want to own their part in the reasoning behind things that happen. So,
or they want to believe that it's equally, like the black people are sort of equally responsible. Like if you were to search hard enough, you'd find as many incidents of black people being violent with white people, and so therefore it all kind of, in their mind, evens out. There's no acknowledgement of the underlying and main issue that gave rise to all of this.
Right. That's a deflection. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Now, you mentioned to me, you didn't mention to me, I already knew that you have a burden for this race issue. And if you had a primary message that you would give to white Christians about racial unity, what would you say? If you were sitting in a room with a bunch of people that you grew up with and went to church with in Orange County, and none of them were black, and an issue of race came up, can you think of anything you'd say to them?
I'd say, first of all, I think that racism is the masterpiece of Satan. I think that it keeps coming back. It's something he invented, which is like a perfect enemy, because it not only inspires just the worst kind of violence, and when it's at its worst, I mean, it inspires unspeakable actual violence and the most horrible behavior. But in its more subtle forms, it never really goes away. It's kind of like the whack-a-mole. You beat it down in one area and it kind of pops up in another area. And it doesn't. And here's what's interesting. If you were to talk to most white evangelicals, and most evangelicals in fact, and if you were to say, do you think the world is more or less moral than it used to be in times past? Do you think we're moving in a more moral direction or a less moral? They would go, oh no, the world's gone to hell in a handbasket. Things are much worse. The world is much more immoral now than it used to be. And you say, well, do you think that the Bible, say in Revelation, or do you think it predicts that? Do you think the Bible says things are going to get worse and worse until Jesus comes again? They go, absolutely. The Bible, lets us know that we can expect the world is going to become an increasingly immoral place. And then you go to them, well, what about racism? Do you think racism is better now or worse than it used to be? Oh, racism's a lot better. Racism has practically been eliminated, Yeah. Now, I acknowledge we've made great strides in our country, and, after the civil rights movement, we continue to, hone and improve things in a legal sense. But like I said, when I say that racism is the masterpiece of Satan, it never really goes away. It just pops up in other forms. But white people tend to think that, we solved that. We passed a law or we closed a loophole, and now we don't have to think about this anymore because it's better. And it's like, why do we become all of a sudden Darwinists on the issue of race? If Darwinist believes that life's just getting better and better and that things are evolving in a positive direction, all of a sudden we're in that camp when it comes to race, going, yeah, things just get better. The longer you live, the better racism, or the more it goes away. And yet every other category of morality, we're willing to go like, oh, it's so bad. And there's just a hypocrisy there. It's a blindness, I see. And another thing I would say is, a lot of people, I've gotten this comment sometimes from white friends, like, Kevin, get off this issue of race. Why are you even talking about this? And especially when I'm just talking to other white people, like, they don't want somebody who's white. Like, why are you bringing this up when we don't have to talk about it? Like, there's nobody in our midst who's of color. And I get some of this on social media, and suddenly it occurred to me to put it like this. I hope this is a helpful analogy. As Christians, very few of us are Jewish, right? There's some Jewish Christians, but a lot of Christians are not Jewish.
Right.
But as Christians and as students of the Bible, we are very interested and very much students of Jewish history, because the whole Old Testament gives the history of the Jews and what led up to the coming of Christ and all the symbolism of what they believed in the holidays and the festivals they celebrated and how things were fulfilled in Christ. So as a Christian, I'm not Jewish, but I'm quite interested in Jewish people and what they believe and what their practices are. Okay, and I don't have to be Jewish to have that interest.
Right.
So I say, as an American, I don't have to be black to be interested in the American story, and that the African American story is foundational to who we are and who we have been as Americans. Yeah. And I don't need to be black to acknowledge that and to understand that. When I was a kid, I mentioned not knowing hardly any black people when I was young, but one thing I did was I saw a lot of movies and I read a lot of books. And to be honest, some of the most inspiring and heroic stories that I ever read were African American stories. So before I ever really knew any black people, I was being inspired by this incredible story of what had happened to black people in our country. And the people who were able to achieve anything or survive that and accomplish a lot just really inspired me. And so those people were my heroes. Sorry, I'm getting kind of emotional.
It's okay.
Because it's deep.
Well,
it's deep.
Here's the question that I have. I ran across the scripture this morning when I was thinking about this. And we have if you were to go to the church you used to go to, and walk around and talk to 100 different people, and ask them if they truly, truly believe in God, and if they love God, and if they consider themselves to be Christian, they probably all tell you yes, right?
Sure.
But the Bible says whoever claims to love God, yet hates his brother or sister, is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen.
Yes. However, I would say most white people say, well, I don't hate anybody. I don't hate anybody. That's the thing. It's this idea of like, I don't see color. They think that's the be all and end all of diversity, is like if you just You know, like, because they would say, I don't have any ill will towards people of color. What they don't understand, though, is just treating people differently and unwillingness to cross over and bridge that gap, that they are excluding people. And I know majority white churches that black people attend, and they don't feel that they're entirely included in the life of that church. You know, that's just a phenomenon that I think a lot of black people would say, yeah, I've experienced that.
Well, but my point is, no, I don't think that they hate. But that was the 20th verse. Mm-hmm. The 21st verse says, and he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister.
Yes.
I think there's something lost in the translation of love and hate. I think there's something lost in that transition. Okay, this verse, if you were to just look at it directly for what it says, there's no in between. There's no in between.
Loving,
if you're not loving, you're hating. There's no in between.
Yeah.
So if you're not loving, you're hating. Right. So if you say that you don't hate me, but you can't say you love me,
right,
then that's a difficult.
You're absolutely right. And there's been a long history in our country of wanting to be separate but equal. Like, just don't offend my sensibilities, whatever that's supposed to be. Like somehow, the tone of somebody's skin, like it's like you don't want to be around a person because they have a different skin tone than you. I don't understand that way of thinking.
Now let me admit, though the motivation may be different, there are a lot of black people that are as guilty of hate as some white people are.
Sure.
I know some black people that do not like white people at all, don't want to be around them, that type of, and for me, that's just as wrong. Even though the motivation for it may be different,
right?
God doesn't go for that.
Right.
Even though you did something to me, I'm not supposed to hate you. You know, and I think that that's something that Martin Luther King tried to establish among my people.
Right.
Was that even though you've been done wrong, two wrongs don't make it right.
Well, you said something to me the other day that was you can't have reconciliation without justice. The pastor that I talked to, he was like, a lot of people, and I find that a lot of white people, and I have a lot of white friends, all my life, since I grew up. I grew up in an area where the only people I saw that were white were when I went to the store or went to school. But after I got out in the world, all that changed. Yeah. And I found that there was a lot to learn, and there were a lot of great people. And I started to learn and take people one at a time instead of being in groups, and that kind of stuff. But I think that you have to. Well, just let me ask you this: if you had a vision, what is your vision of diversity for the church? Well, so this is a thought. It's not original to me. I've heard our pastor say this, but I totally agree with it. So many white people stop at thinking that diversity is a visual. Like they would just be happy if they look out across the congregation and they see different shades of skin represented, different races, Asian, and if we had a little bit of everybody, that's great, because we know heaven's going to be like that. That's kind of the cliche thing we always say. Heaven's going to be like, we got to get used to it. But diversity, if it's just a visual, if it stops at the visual and we're not talking to each other and we're not in each other's homes and sharing our lives with each other, then it's not worth anything. We're not penetrating, and that's frankly where I was in my life for much of my younger adult years. I had a deep heart to understand racial issues, but I wasn't really reaching towards people. I think I felt awkward about it. I was like, how do I broach this? And another thing I learned is it's not up to black people to educate me on the black experience, right? So like I can't go and say like, unload on me all of your hurt and all your pain and all the things. It's like it takes time to build those kinds of friendships, and you have to have the right settings, and somebody has to be willing, and they don't owe it to you to teach you those things. So you have to kind of understand that, because there are some well-intentioned white people who would just want to go to the first black person they see and just, teach me what you've, and that's awkward as well.
Oh, well, I've known a lot of people that have trusted me enough to ask me questions like that. Mm-hmm. And when I was in my 20s, I felt like, because I was in such a diverse situation, that I owed it to my people to show them that what they thought was not the case with all black people, by being who I was and acting the way that I acted and having the values that I had, to try to educate some people to think that. But to your point about the reconciliation part, that pastor went on Facebook, and there are a lot of people that they just don't want to deal with the situation. They just want to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Okay, that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
They just want to sing that everything's, mamas and the papas, everything's nice, But I asked him, I said, can there be reconciliation before justice? And he came back to me and thanked me for asking the question. Mm-hmm. Because God himself instituted justice before reconciliation
was possible. Yeah.
Jesus died on the cross to establish the justice by taking all of our sins on him.
Right.
At that point in time, our believing in him allowed us to reconcile with God.
Yes.
So justice has to come first. Reconciliation, total reconciliation, God's reconciliation, I believe, comes after the justice.
Yes.
That's the reason that I'm trying to say to the right wing that may or may not understand what they're supporting. I'm trying to make them understand it so they can say, ouch.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So they can just...
Ta-Nehisi Coates has a great quote. This is a little bit harsh, so forgive this illustration, but this is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He says, white people tend to think you can stab a black person 10 times and the damage is over and the problem is solved the moment you take the knife out.
Yeah.
The moment you take the knife out. In other words, you just stab somebody 10 times, right?
Yeah.
So there's some repair that needs to happen, right? There's some aid that needs to be rendered.
Yeah.
But with white people often it's like, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I stopped doing that thing that was hurting you. So what's the problem? What are we still talking about?
Yeah.
That's solved, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very apt quote. So when you talk about justice before there can be reconciliation.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much. I'm going to close this up now. I appreciate you more than you know.
I appreciate you. Thank you for giving me this platform to speak, because I'm trying to formulate my words better on this issue. And so opportunities like this help me. Because what I want to do is speak to more white audiences. Yeah. And I have to figure out a way to do that in a way that will be loving and will not put them off, but will still allow them to hear what it is I want to communicate.
I have some ideas. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
We'll talk about that. Okay, as far as my listeners are concerned, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And as I always say, pain in some ways is a good thing, because pain comes to let us know that something's not right. When we feel the pain, we start trying to fix it. So hopefully some of you guys said ouch. See you next time.